Okay, this is a new one with some information from the Younger Dryas Boundary event, and it's really not necessarily about that, but the fact that it was confirmed, and in fact, even skeptics of this have turned around and by listening to the information, changed their mind, and now are a proponent of the idea. Sounds pretty odd, and if you've ever watched it, it was on the Joe Rogan podcast where they had Randall Carlson and uh, Shermer was on there also, and he's a skeptic. But at the time, they also had a satellite link hooked up to this guy named Dr. Mark DeFont. If you ever watched it, Mark DeFont came on later, and he was the one that was razzing Graham Hancock and calling him a pseudo-archaeologist and all kinds of bull. And he pinned him down and got him to recant on that, and that he would re-edit it and do this, that, and the other, but was actually interested in this book that was by this Powell person, and it tells you here that he's changed his mind after reading this. And so while he was real cocky and defensive during the show, now given the opportunity to look over the information as he was told to do, he agrees with the information. He does finish it off telling you he doesn't agree with this ancient civilization idea, but that's because nobody's shown him enough of that information too either. In fact, they almost came into this not knowing very much. Well, they knew a lot. They knew ancient research and people that have written things that kind of discredit it, and so they had that up in the ready and named a few papers. But also, if you'll remember the show, while they were naming those few papers, Carlson was able to cut a few of those off and show you that that wasn't necessarily the reality of it either. Here's the way the show looked, and so it had Michael Shermer and Joe Rogan, Randall, Carlson, and Graham Hancock here on the podcast itself, and then they could only have one person at a time come on. Wow, that's all bleached out. There you go. And it could only have one person at a time on the podcast the way that they had it with the extra hookup, and so they had to do one and then the other. So he doesn't get onto the thing till an hour and a half or 2 hours into it, I think they tell you. But it was podcast number 961. It shows you right here, so you can go back and look at this. And this was debating things that were going on with the Younger Dryas. Almost the more interesting one was the one that they did before this point, where it's just them talking about all the information and stuff too. And if they were able to go back and look at that information and then try to secondarily verify it, they would have had that. So they say same thing, different skeptic, and Michael Shermer, they said, comes around. So apparently that has already happened, but on Tusk Defiant here, and it was just a few days ago, it's the 20th now, but this was like the 12th or something, and it came out, and they want to let you know, and this is on the Tusk site that that Randall Carlson runs. It's part of the sacred geometry group that he has got going on in his deal. And so he puts on there, Dr. Mark DeFont did a great thing this morning by announcing on Twitter and his blog that he had come around to support the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. As I told Mark, my respect for his intellectual integrity soared whenever I saw his tweet. I have recently read James Lawrence Powell's entitled Deadly Voyage, and I am now convinced that there were comet airbursts that formed the Younger Dryas impact. I explain more in detail here, and he shows that, which is written down here apparently, on June 8th. I'm sorry, it was the 12th. Maybe he put it on here on the 12th. I didn't find out till today from CFAPS had one on his site about the same thing. DeFont's reversal on the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis after his public skepticism is a good science action. And I agree with this. I mean, I've actually had a few things debunked while we've been doing these videos over the last couple of years. One by a person that does videos along with me and stuff. Phoenician 7, or known as Egyptologist 7. One of her genetic papers doesn't go with this thing, and the pottery shard type gold crap, and we definitely come to the consensus that, well, genetics doesn't lie, but also we realize that there's only been a few of them tested, and it's a pretty decent group testing, but they don't find the genetics that I was talking about in that group except for one person, and it isn't even a majority or a good substantial point of the ones that were tested. So it kind of ruined that idea. But like I tell you, there was people arguing about pottery shards and who brought what where and who was the Nakata thing and where they da-da-da, and now we find they were Natufians. And so that kind of makes it ineligible for my thing in the first place, but genetics verified it. And it says that they were a mix, but yet neither one of them are the haplotype that is given for the Sumerians. Therefore, maybe not. But also, the Sumerian test that they have, are they looking at the most ancient of them in the group that started that off compared to like the people of Hattusha and stuff? Are they getting that comparison of people? Is that J also, or which one is that? That's neither here nor there, though. So unlike politics, where people pick sides and stick to them come what may, which y'all are noticing here recently, in fact, it's gone way out in left field. So far out in left field, they're up in the cheap seats, not even playing the game anymore. But Mark clearly operates according to the best traditions and underpinnings of reasons in science, where any position is subject to persuasion, giving sufficient data and appropriate interpretation. In an admirable twist, Mark credits his reassessment of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis to a recommendation from his Joe Rogan debate anniversary, Graham Hancocjs, to read a recent book by James Lawrence Powell. It's not surprising that DeFont was persuaded by the book. Dr. Powell is also a former Younger Dryas skeptic, and Deadly Voyagers become an essential read for the subject, unless you care to pick your way through every paper on the subject. Good for Dr. DeFont, good for the Younger Dryas, and good for science. The system works. So here they've got his posting on this, and it says directly from him, in my debate with Graham Hancocjs on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast beginning at 2:03, so it was 2 hours into it, and a critique of Graham's book I wrote for Skeptic magazine along with the further details on my website, I found myself dealing with the veracity of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. I was skeptical of the hypothesis, but stated the following in my Skeptic paper, that the debate proceeds in the proper scientific manner, i.e. publishing results in peer-reviewed scientific journals, as Malcolm Lecomte, one of the Comet researchers, pointed out in our debate. That was the other guy that was called in before his guy that is recanting here. And there are 4 indicators that the Younger Dryas bounty that there may be due to an extraterrestrial origin: nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, melt glass, and the platinum group metals. It's kind of undeniable when you get the grouping together. It's just like, well, see? It's got a fingerprint. My major problem with the Younger Dryas was the claim that the megafauna and Clovis culture went extinct as a result of the proposed comet strike. I noted in the Skeptic paper that scientists have also been a bit incredulous that comet strike would wipe out all the megafauna as far south as Patagonia, while leaving mammoths alive and well on one little St. Paul Island, Alaska, until 3,700 years ago. And there is that effect where these mammoths got trapped on there and turned into micro mammoths, if you will. Same kind of thing happened in islands of the Aegean too, and that's where the idea for the Cyclops come and so on. There's dwarf elephants from there. But I recently had some correspondence with Graham, and he suggested that I read a recent book by James Lawrence Powell entitled Deadly Voyager, the Ancient Comet Strike That Changed Earth and Human History in 2020. So it just came out this year. It's a superb book and absolutely convinced me that there were comet airbursts, plural, at the Younger Dryas, and that the airburst probably killed the megafauna, which in turn caused the Clovis culture to cease existence, partially by diminishing human numbers, but also because there was no need to have Clovis spearheads that could kill non-existent megafauna, he says. And I go question that. They had the same type stuff, but the Salutrians are the ones that had giant blades that even looked like they could really fighting the mammoths. The other guys had stuff that were 3.5, 4 inches maybe, and then smaller than that for main things. But of course, they're shooting birds and everything too. So you have little bitty ones all the way up to bigger and so on. But then all of a sudden it just falls off. And so there's a culture. Now, in a minute, he talks about, I don't see no lost culture, but he just admitted the Clovis culture, it's lost. Worse than that, there are more than them for the Göbekli Tepe culture. Poof. Well, it's not lost. We're figuring out who that became, but there was a few thousand-year gap here before they show up here, and then here. There's gaps in between each one. Where were they in between? Or was our timing off a little bit? Anyhow, so he tells you that it probably killed off the megafauna, which in turn killed those Clovis off. But I've not been keeping up with the debate since 2017, so he didn't know the new stuff, and so I was thrilled to see the new evidence that has come to light and the lack of scientific merit in the studies that attempted to dismiss the hypothesis. In other words, he saw the new papers that he was unaware of, even though he was in the debate, and Graham was, and Carlson was telling him about these things and stuff, but they were referring to older papers and a lot of it and trying to discredit it. But into looking of it, he says, well, I see that here it looks like it, and then the people that are trying to dismiss it looking pretty lame. I recommend the book. It's fascinating to read. The evidence is overwhelming and nicely collected and summarized by Powell. It's clear that the PT signature shows up precisely where it is expected about 12,900 years ago in all of the sites, and high-pressure nanodiamonds melt glass carbon from forest fires that took over all the whole area. So it's like everything got singed. Everything got the outskirts of a nuclear bomb, but everything that was around there, a large portion of it, northern hemisphere, but reaching all the way to Patagonia. As forest fires, magnetic spherules, etc., show up precisely where they're expected over 4 continents. I also have to admit the Younger Dryas' extremely good argument that the megafauna died out from the comet airburst and the Clovis culture was impacted. The forest fires alone wreaked havoc across the continents. The mammoth existing on St. Paul Island seems to be a minor incidental or a fluke when compared to the other evidence, and a crater is not required. No wonder they don't find the shocked minerals. The airburst would have kept earth minerals out of the equation, especially if it's happening over a continental ice shelf, right? We're lucky we even have the things that we have, and because we have them at that amount and that level, it shows you that this was an extremely large event. If you don't have a giant crater, then what the hell? Well, there is a crater, the Haiwatha crater. So he tells you, finally, the Haiwatha crater that has recently been discovered below the Greenland ice sheet may or may not be related to the Younger Dryas, but is not needed to explain the evidence. So in other words, on top of that, it's already figured out. That just adds to it if it's one that is. If they find out and date it and they go, no, it's 30 million years ago, they go, well, it doesn't matter anyhow. Still, this event happened at this time. We don't need that event. Even though the nanodiamonds are found across there and all the way through Europe and down until Abu Huraira. Right, and then that actually is a site that's related to the Göbekli Tepe people, and then Tufian type people too. The people of Catalhoyuk type area. And they themselves have a destruction event. And then there's, of course, the Sodom and Gomorrah type tales and so on else. So, of course, all this does not change my view on Graham's most recent books, he says, though. I enjoyed reading his latest entitled America Before in 2019 because it's well written and his knowledge of archaeology is superb. But I say the Skeptic article, to be clear, the Younger Dryas debate is not over the lost civilizations. So it's not necessarily that, but he's saying, well, maybe it is. I mean, the Clovis people aren't there anymore, right? So there's one, and we might be able to figure out there's a few more. So although I consider Graham a friend, I disagree with his lost civilization scenario with all the respect that he deserves. And hey, I think that's good enough. You don't have to agree with everything. You can look at some of his evidence later and do that. And so I commend this guy, as I do anybody who is stuck on one point and then seeing enough evidence went the other way. And there we go. It's just another verifier, but it's a verifier of a major skeptic. I don't know how much pull this has with it, but it sure sets the bar over on this side of the table farther and farther. And because there's so many people doing this, some of these people are trying to refute it, and they're falling flat on their face, and another paper's coming out to prove it again. And so we start getting this stacked up thing. And instead of a hypothesis, it's going to start becoming a fact as much as Chicxulub was. And Chicxulub was dramatic enough to turn T-Rexes and dinosaurs into chickens. Like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy. On to the next one. Peace.